Michael, I guess good evening in Melbourne and good late morning from Jerusalem. We've known each other, I'm trying to remember, probably at least 15 years. And I don't remember if I met
Probably 20.
maybe 20. We met, I think, in Melbourne or maybe in Canberra. You were a member of parliament at the time, Labour Party, very active on the issues that we deal with.
I was secretary of the Parliamentary Friends of Israel, or president, depending who was in government. And we got you to appear to one of our usually well-attended lunches as a guest.
In Canberra.
Yeah.
That's right. I remember that. That was so we've known each other and we've exchanged information on issues, particularly in the area of NGOs, which is what we work, the role of non-governmental organizations in different frameworks, and the Australian connection primarily in terms of the funding that the Australian government, like many other Western governments, has given to organizations, both somewhat in the realm of human rights and other important principles for Western democracy, but primarily in aid, much of it goes to the Palestinian Authority. And the main focus of our discussion today actually goes back, it's a piece of history, but it suddenly became very relevant. World Vision Australia, around $50 million reportedly were provided and largely, significantly, at least half diverted to Hamas over a number of years. And I'll just remind those, our listeners or viewers, that in 2016, so almost 10 years ago, the Israeli government, the Israeli security services, arrested the head of World Vision's Gaza operation, Mohammed al-Khalabi, and charged him with having diverted money to Hamas for terror activities. I remember that very well because that was something that was unusual. It was a public indictment. The details were revealed. A lot of very specific claims, accusations of diversion for all sorts of different projects that Hamas was using at the time. And that was 10 years ago. It was 8 years, 7 years before the October 7th atrocities. And most of the money came from Australia, from the Australian government, funneled through World Vision Australia. And at the time, and in the years that followed, including the very lengthy trial and then the conviction of Khalabi, World Vision Australia, particularly Tim Costello, in many, many different forms said this is all a lie, it's all a frame-up. That's all history. But the reason that it's become suddenly important is that there were documents that were found, thousands of documents were found, but some of them in particular related to this case, and basically reaffirms and verifies the Israeli case. The court case was largely conducted behind closed doors, in a civilian court, but behind closed doors. And the documents, there are something like 15 pages that have been released, and are available. We'll have them on the, we'll put the link into the notes. They were in Arabic, three meetings that took place during the trial, and shows how closely Hamas was following that case, how much detailed information they had, even though it was a closed trial. The notes talk about having somebody who was reporting directly to Hamas in the courtroom. We can speculate, but it won't be useful really. It could be somebody related to the case, probably the defense team in some way. And that became a major story because it demonstrated that in a clear way that the claims that were made in Australia, particularly by World Vision, throughout this period were false. That became that was written up in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Australian front page. It opens up and it raises many, many questions, and that's what I want to talk to you about. Maybe we can start by you talking a little bit about what your recollections of the case are, and then I want to get into the issue of media coverage in Australia, and then we can talk a little bit about what the implications are and where we go from there. So that's my broad outline. We can play it by ear. I hand over the
First of
floor.
all, We should point out that it was in the Beersheba District Court.
Yes.
So it's a recognised court in Israel. It wasn't some fantasy that poor Reverend Costello imagined. It was a normal court that you'd have in a democratic society. And this all happened, if we zoom backwards in history too, before Hamas tunnels at 2023 onwards assumed such international significance. This guy and this organisation and this abuse of Australian taxpayers' money was used before, and we demonstrated it before. I'm not sure whether Mr. Halabi's head actually popped out of some of the tunnel openings, but according to the documents that I read and the accusations that were made against him ultimately proved true in court, that the placements of some of these tunnels was done with his cooperation. So it's, as you said, very specific, very unusual, and it predates the much more serious problem of 7 October and where all of the poor hostages were taken.
Yeah, that was the construction of the tunnels cost a huge amount of money, whether directly in cash or in aid materials, concrete. The estimate is, and the IDF is still finding and destroying tunnels. The estimate is that there were 500 kilometers. That means everything under Gaza, the hospitals, the mosques, the residences, the schools, they all were on top of this vast underground terror network, which also was production sites where 30,000 rockets and missiles were hidden. So we can assume, and not just assume, but it was part of the court record that was published, part of the verdict, part of it was made public, part of the indictment, that in fact Australian taxpayer funds provided significant support for this horrendous terror structure that Israel is still working to remove, this armament of Hamas. All of that goes together. And it highlights the denial and the lack of oversight that took place with this fund. It's not just about World Vision, not just about this one incident or one
Exactly.
within an incident. It's a pattern that I think sets the stage for fundamental changes in how aid has to be delivered, particularly when it involves taxpayer funds.
And Gerald, it was a pattern that NGO Monitor discovered before the importance of it was as widely understood as it is. What World Vision was doing, diverting money to building of tunnels and supporting Hamas and having dual personnel, is the paradigm of what our narrative is about what happened with UNRWA and all of these other fake organisations that were in fact just muppets for Hamas in Gaza, and who were, I mean, it's outrageous. Australian taxpayers don't want their money being spent on killing Israelis or building undergrounds in Gaza to situate missiles. It's, the whole story was, that's why they fought so hard, because I think they understood, World Vision and its apologists, that the truth of what we were saying was so devastating to their cause. And you'll remember that we held, I think our first media action in this was a press conference at the Jerusalem Press Club. You may not remember something that happened all during the conference. There was a cameraman from the Australian Broadcasting Commission,
I do remember,
there the whole time, who was seconded to do it by the very pro-Palestinian ABC Jerusalem correspondent Sophie McNeil, who subsequently went off to work for, guess, Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, if you're watching, and then she became a West Australian Greens Member of Parliament. Now, the Green political party in Australia is far to the left, fanatically anti-Israel. It's not like the German Greens at all. So here we have a cameraman sent by this person. And what happened? Nothing. There was not a word of it ever broadcast on the ABC, and it was because you and I were so moderate, well-informed. We were saying that this was an abuse of Australian taxpayers' money, and they didn't want that story to go on to the million television viewers who watch that network.
You followed the Australian media more closely than I did, but I do remember this was a story that went on for a number of years. The conviction was in 2020, so we're talking about 4 years. And I think we should also add for the record that in I think it was early 2024, among the early exchanges of Israeli hostages for Palestinian terror prisoners, that Hamas put Mohammed al-Khalabi, the head of World Vision's operation in Gaza, on their priority list, and he was released. It would not have happened if if he was not an important part of the Hamas operation. But I want to go back to the media aspects of this, and the way and the broader public issues, because this was ABC, and your example is spot on. But it was covered, among others, by Sophie McNeil, but always from the position and the statements that were made by World Vision. So, for instance, they said they did an audit, and the audit cleared them, showed that there was no misuse or diversion of funds. They never released the audit, as far as I know, and the details. But the question came up, and I remember we both addressed that, perhaps at that same press conference. The question of how World Vision, it was probably later actually, a couple of years later, how World Vision, or whoever did the audit, could know what happened once the materials and the money go into Gaza. Gaza was a totally closed, hermetically sealed terrorist regime run by Hamas. Nothing happened in Gaza, including, as we now know, any of the operations of World Vision without having Hamas people being directly involved. We call it guarantors, and that's the report that we did on those documents in which World Vision figures prominently. They said, World Vision repeatedly said, and it was echoed as if this was completely true. We call it the word of God without any checking, that they did an audit. The audit came out clean. I remember that at the time, the Australian government, and particularly Ambassador Dave Sharma, who was one of the most talented and well-informed and professional diplomats I've ever met. He was the ambassador of Australia to Israel. I'm sure you know him well. He's now a senator, I believe.
That's right, in New South Wales.
And the Australian government issued a statement that said that we did not find any evidence of diversion. And that meant, and he was very clear, that there was no evidence to find. There was no way of checking all of that. It wasn't a clean bill of health, but immediately the combination of the World Vision team in Australia and their media echo chamber pronounced them clean. And that's one of
they turned that negative into a double negative, as if it was affirming their position.
Right.
And it was manifestly not true. All the Australian government said was that we don't have any evidence ourselves. We didn't send in auditors. We don't have the ability to have our secret services penetrate Gaza and see where Australian taxpayers' money was spent. But they said that we don't have any evidence in our hands. So they turned that into a Gunsa Magilla, as they say. You know, it wasn't a Gunsa Magilla. It was just a negative, and that was used again and again and again by these the same gang that's been apologising for Hamas all through this 2.5 years of the war.
You know, I remember there were a lot of incidents in here. And at the end of the trial, the verdict, the judge reading the verdict, was a public event. And I remember that World Vision, the World Vision team, and we believe, and I'm not sure how well this is documented, but we believe that World Vision, it makes sense, paid for al-Khalabi's defense team, hired the lawyers, and also stalled the process repeatedly over the 4 years. There were many, we were told in a standard operating procedure, here's the evidence, they have a chance he can plead guilty, get a lighter sentence. And they refused, and we understand that was at the advice of World Vision's legal team. Again, they didn't want to be sullied. They thought they could bully their way out of it. So at the verdict, they brought in a whole group of European government ambassadors that were based in Ramallah or Jerusalem, led by the EU representative at the time, who was also very strong, I think it's an understatement, supporter of the Palestinian cause. I think it's Sven Kuhn von Bergsdorf. He brought in, and this was a public event. The verdict was an open event. So you have World Vision essentially orchestrating this entire process for 4 years, both in terms of manipulating the media, the diplomatic corps that was sympathetic to the Palestinians, as much as they could in the court process with the delays and everything else. It strikes me as something that needs to be investigated more deeply.
This kind of narcissism and vanity of non-government organisations when they've been found out or made a mistake ought to be responded to honestly, as they demand of governments, that they admit a mistake was made, they investigate it, they have some sympathy with the people who produce the evidence, including the defector within World Vision. I haven't heard a word of sympathy for the accountant inside World Vision, who at least is a person of equally high ethics to Mr. Halabi, and the vanity of the Reverend Costello and his media apologists is we can't say anything that is righteous or ethical because we must defend our previous position and our giving out of this Australian taxpayers' money to this terrorist organisation. Remember, Gerald, in Australia, Hamas is classified as a terrorist organisation as well. So giving money to it by World Vision was a breach of Australian law.
There's another dimension to this in terms of if there's going to be, and I would hope that there's going to be some sort of parliamentary discussion, perhaps an investigation. And you may remember this from our discussions, NGO Monitor, independently of what was going on during the legal case, started to look at the financial records that were public. It turns out that World Vision produced 3 sets of records which were totally inconsistent with each other. And we pointed it out, we documented that. There was the World Vision International set of financial records. There was the Australian branch of World Vision, specifically with the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem branch. And then World Vision, for some reason, set up an Israeli legal entity, a nonprofit within Israel, that for a while published or produced, reported another independent set of figures. So the number of staff members, the salaries, the total amounts that were involved were off by at least a factor of 3 or 4. One group was reporting 50 million, one group was reporting only less than 10 million. I remember a number of times that we would have the World Vision Australia, whether it was Costello or somebody else, saying our entire budget was less than 10 or 15 million during this period. How could Al-Khalabi have diverted 50 million? But their own records showed very different sums. Nobody, I don't remember anybody in the Australian media, except the Australian Jewish News, who took that very public piece of information and did anything with it. And by the way, I'll just add that a couple of years later, the Israeli Registrar of Nonprofits went to the Jerusalem court with the documents, first of all, showing that there were checks, and maybe even cash, I don't remember, but checks, records of checks that were given to Hamas people by the Israeli operation of World Vision. The court then, after they stopped filing, the World Vision entity stopped filing the records after the arrest took place, the required accounting details, and the entity was closed for having failed to meet the requirements of the...
it was closed by the Jerusalem Charities Organization.
Yeah, by the Israeli government. The Israeli, well, it was the court. The process is that the registrar of nonprofits has to go to the court with the documentation, and then the judge has to go through the documents and then issue a decision. And that took place maybe a couple of years ago.
Entirely fair. It's exactly the same process in all other Western countries, where if someone was accused of malfeasance by the Charities Commission, which is what it's called here, you'd have to go to court with proof of that malfeasance, and then they'd be deregistered. So again, these people hide in open cover.
And there was no interest in the Australian media because we would always send this material out and make it public. And as I said, I think the Australian Jewish News would cover it. And then usually we get a response also, a complete denial from World Vision Australia. But the records were there. And the fact that the media, the journalists, not just Sophie McNeil, but others, just didn't want to see this. And they kept talking about the secrecy of the trial. And of course, there were security considerations, particularly for the life of the accountants who provided the information, and perhaps others. Israel collected information. It was made very clear in the court process. Some of it was cited in the verdict. And yet, again, these were issues that the attack against the Israeli judiciary system was the dominant theme of World Vision, I would say, in quotes, defense, and not looking at the publicly available information, which totally corroborated everything that was charged in the indictment and then what was publicly available in the course of the case.
And when the judge's verdict was finally given at the Beersheba District Court, Tim Costello was the next day in the main Liberal newspaper here, the Melbourne Age, saying it was a set-up and he was totally innocent, and what you'd expect from a person who was not willing to examine the evidence. And the chutzpah of the Age was that they were so worded up that when I responded the next day to put in a gently worded argument that, you have to examine the evidence, and that good intentions is not a cover for giving Australian taxpayers money out to registered terrorist organisations. They said, unless I provided them with a notarised translation of the 71 pages, they couldn't publish anything from me. But it was okay for the Reverend Costello. So you just in that juxtaposition of those two articles, you can see your point about them having different standards.
It's interesting in that's completely consistent with the entire record. After the Age published Sydney Morning Herald published the information on the documents. And again, it's worthwhile for anybody and I particularly would urge people at World Vision and members of Parliament, the government, to study these documents because they're very detailed. These are protocols of meetings held. These were crisis meetings, and I'm looking at the names of who was involved in this. The director of the Division of Counter-Espionage, and we have the Arabic originals as well, and the Division of Foreign Activity, Military Intelligence. They were all involved in these meetings that took place. They knew exactly, Hamas knew exactly what was going on in the secret trial. And their entire focus was, how do we disrupt this process? It's interesting that in response to the article, I've forgotten the name of the journalist, I think it's
Rob Harris.
Rob Harris wrote a very good analysis. It was actually very different than the articles that were written back in the last 10 years. He actually looked at documents and presented the information, but then Al-Halabi himself responded, and Rob Harris wrote a piece on his response. And it's interesting because it's the same slogans that we've heard for 10 years. These documents are obviously fabricated, according to him. Now, there are pages and pages of them. And they bear not just the seal. Somebody would have had to work. It's not just World Vision. There are, I've forgotten how many NGOs, but we've something like over 130 sets of documents dealing with NGO links, all with the same process. The World Vision case is different because there was a court case, and it was very visible, and we had this big back and forth that took place, as we've talked about. But the fact that they still, Al-Halabi and one has to assume at the advice of the same people that gave him the advice, bad advice for the last 10 years, these are lies, that there were no such things, as that there was no diversion, the use of pure fabrications. He said that the World Vision employees wanted to attend the hearings and testify that the accusations were false. And all that stuff is completely in a different world. Bring people from Gaza, who part of the Hamas infrastructure and the World Vision infrastructure, whatever they would have said had no credibility anyway. So it's just this process. They're still clinging to the idea that they can refute what is very straight evidence and has been for the last 10 years, very clear evidence.
But this is a sort of like micro example of that whole literature that Matty Friedman and other people have written about, and that is the penetration of the media, the legacy media in the United States, Canada, Australia, the UK,
Europe.
of people who are activists. They're not journalists. So the fluke that we got with the reporting of the new secret documents that you were able to publish and release was that you found an old-fashioned journalist who went through all of the stuff and examined it. He wasn't a woke activist who couldn't see anything from Israel without prejudice blinkers.
And I'm sure he got a lot of flack from that from some of his colleagues. Matthew Friedman's article in The Atlantic, and I've forgotten how many years ago that was, but it was also a number of years ago. But he also talked about the fact that it's not just the woke activism, progressive politics, but very much a mutual dependence system. NGOs, and we're talking about organizations, I've forgotten what World Vision's annual budget is. Internationally, it's a couple of billion US dollars. We're talking large amounts of money, much of which provided by governments like Australia. Much of it does go to good humanitarian activities, but with no oversight. So the process, it's not just World Vision, it's Oxfam, it's Human Rights Watch, it's Amnesty. These powerful NGOs are very closely linked to the journalists. They need the journalists to give them the platforms and really basically giving them the echo chamber. And the journalists benefit from having the NGOs feed them straight. They have headline stories out of it. And that's what Matti Friedman documented. He also documented.
And of course, it enhances your credibility if you can quote Amnesty and Human Rights Watch.
Experts.
You can't quote Oxfam as much as you used to, because I noticed the former director of Oxfam has testified about the systematic and inherent and persistent bias of her organisation in dealing with matters to do with Israel. So hopefully one day Gerald will have a defector from Human Rights Watch who will testify as to how Ken Roth kept his boot on the neck of that organisation to make sure that it reflected his ardent views. And Amnesty, forget Israelis. Every Ukrainian in the world knows what a fake organisation that is now, who just doesn't really support. God help us if Professor Zakharov and all of the Russian dissidents were needing their help these days. None of them would get it. They're such a terrible far-left organisation that is basic. One of the things you have to not underestimate too with World Vision and with Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and Oxfam is their businesses. They're businesses for these NGO executives who will never stand for public office and run on a pro-Palestinian platform in a Western society or a woke, but they want to affect politics, be activists through the system. They're truly, as Antonio Gramsci said, they've done their long march through the institutions. And it's their way of altering the course of events.
There's a huge amount of power, you're absolutely right, with no public accountability. And perhaps the World Vision case, even though it goes back 10 years, but the documents are new and very clear, will give us the opportunity, give the governments, responsible members of parliament, even journalists, the opportunity to change that paradigm, to change that see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil approach, which has been the dominant one, as we said, on all these activities.
As a volunteer and an advisory member of NGO Monitor's international board, you can be assured that I have circulated some of those documents to MPs and people who ought to be interested in them. The problem is in Australia at the moment is so many people are so consumed with the Royal Commission into anti-Semitism and to what happened at Bondi, that it may not be at the top of their mind, but we'll reconnect them when we get a bit past that.
There is a lot, and of course the tragedy of Bondi is something that still will resonate for a very long time. This is the pales in comparison, but if you go back to October 7th, 2023, and it's the horrendous attack that took place and all the victims and how that fed the anti-Semitism. October 7th wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the blindness of the funders of the aid. And that fed the entire process. And then we get to genocide and all the hate, all the lies that are part of that process. So I do connect the dots, even though it's a loose connection.
Gerald, there was a humble Russian Jewish immigrant who testified in Sherry Markson's superb documentary on Bondi, which I urge anyone who's watching this podcast to go and look. You can probably get it on YouTube. And he understood something that you and I understand, but I think a lot of these journalists don't understand, that ideology and narrative lead to action. So Bondi didn't happen in a vacuum. The build-up took place for years, and the years were these organisations being taken over by hard-left activists, these organisations pushing an anti-Israel narrative. And after October 7, the primary anti-Israel narrative that they pushed throughout the whole world, it began in small places like what they did in World Vision.
I think that's a good place for us to end this discussion. I think we've put a lot of important issues on the table, a lot of material for further thought, and perhaps we'll revisit this, particularly in a few months, particularly if there are discussions in the Australian Parliament and if there is follow-up.
Before I go, I just wanted to thank you and NGO Monitor and also our good friends at Human Rights Watch. Without you guys, so much more of this money would have been...
our friends at UN Watch.
This would be exfiltrated to the Hamas and its supporters, to Hezbollah and its supporters. So it's incredibly important work that I think too few people understand. But when I read of your successes in various parliaments, they've decided not to fund UNRWA or not to fund this organisation, etc., because of the clear evidence that you've presented them. It's very commendable.
Michael, thank you for those kind words. And I also want to say that the work that you've done throughout your career, the principled positions that you've taken, the consistent principles that you've taken, and it's cost you, and we know that it's cost you personally, politically, but it's extremely important to have examples like the work that you do, the knowledge that you bring. And we've seen this through the World Vision case. Everything that you said and did, which was ignored, as you said, has turned out to be absolutely accurate and reinforced as the evidence becomes available. So thank you for everything that you've done. And
I appreciate that. My media career is booming. My political career is over. And I spoke to 5,000 beautiful Iranian Australians on the steps of State Parliament House on Sunday, hoping with their most ardent hope for regime change from that terrible satanic mullahocracy that exists there.
I will reinforce what you say and second it, as they say in the UK. Michael, it's always good to talk to you, and let's hope for good news on that front as well. Thank you.
Amen.